The air in this room just changed. You can feel it, the sudden, inexplicable weight on your chest, the way the shadows in the corner seem to lean a little closer to your neck. You think you're alone, but the silence is beginning to breathe. What you are about to hear are not just stories, they are leaks from a reality that hates you. From the gore-stained iron of the high plains to the predatory headlights of a desert nightmare, and finally into the occult geometry of a world hidden beneath the earth. These are chronicles of the moments when the veil thins and the things that wait in the dark finally reach back. Lock your doors, check the locks again. It won't help, but it might make you feel better until the
Nahid Hassan disappeared just 2 hours after sending me this recording. And when I played it, I realized he wasn't alone. You're now on Nightfall Horrors 002, and there's no turning back.
The steel rail stretched toward the horizon like the parched ribs of a colossal, buried Ifrit. I spent my youth staring down that throat of iron, watching my father battle the bureaucracy of the stations and the idiocy of conductors. But I craved the belly of the beast. I wanted the cab, the sensation of 100 iron coffins hooked behind me, rolling through a darkness so thick it felt like the breath of a Selah. I hired on in the 90s, back when a crew was a brotherhood of 5. By the early 2000s, corporate greed had whittled us down to 3, replacing human souls with the cold, unthinking eyes of automation. It was a winter run across the desolate wastes of Colorado, hauling grain hoppers and tankers, a skeletal snake of freight pushing through a landscape where civilization was nothing more than a fading memory. Out there, the tracks are the only proof that humanity ever dared to defy the djinn of the desert. It was just me, my engineer Rick, and a brakeman named Torres in the 2nd unit. The silence between us was heavy, a shared understanding of the rail's predatory nature. The heater was a failing heart, warming only half the cab while the snow drifted in spectral sheets. The radio hissed with a rhythmic, cursed static. Then I saw it. I raised my binoculars, the lenses carving a path through the white void. Something dark lay across the ballast. I expected a coyote, a mere carcass, but as the lead unit thundered over it, the light revealed a visceral crimson. It wasn't oil, it was blood, fresh, steaming, and pulsating with a malevolent vibrancy against the frozen earth. It wasn't a trail, it was an invitation into the Gaib, a dark unseen, leading us deeper into the night. The crimson smear did not dissipate, it grew. What began as scattered droplets soon transformed into a continuous, jagged line, a khat of misfortune drawn across the snow. I keyed the mic, my voice steady despite the growing chill in my marrow. "Torres, you seeing this?" Static screamed back before his voice broke through, hollow and strained. "Yeah, it's blood. Too much of it." Beside me, Rick eased the throttle, the engine's roar dipping into a low, predatory growl. He muttered about wounded deer, but we both knew the truth. No beast of this earth runs the ties while spilling its entire life essence with such calculated precision. The binoculars revealed the next horror. A heavy winter parka lay discarded off the right-of-way, half buried in the drifts. It wasn't merely stained, it was saturated, heavy with a wetness that defied the freezing air. It looked like a shed skin, cast aside by something transitioning into a more terrifying form. "Dispatch, this is 731. I reported, the words feeling like a heavy dua for protection. "We have a blood trail, half a mile long, and discarded clothing. No obstructions yet. Over." The response was clinical, a detached voice from a world that didn't understand the shadows we were piercing. Copy 731. Continue. Authorities notified. As we pushed further into the void, the offerings became more grotesque. 2 socks, one torn with a surgical neatness that suggested no accidental snag. Then a t-shirt, frozen stiff and balled up, rhythmically slapping against the steel rail as we passed, a repetitive wet thud that sounded like a dying pulse. Torres's voice crackled again, stripped of its usual bravado. "You ever see a deer take its clothes off, boss?" I didn't answer. In the occult silence of the high plains, the trail was no longer a mystery. It was a ritual of divestment. Someone or something was stripping away the trappings of humanity while hemorrhaging into the sacred iron.
The deeper we surged into the frozen heart of the plains, the more the air in the cab seemed to thicken with the scent of copper and old graves. The blood trail was no longer a smear. It was a deluge, a river of najas, ritual impurity, staining the sanctified white of the snow. I gripped the binoculars until my knuckles turned as white as the drifts outside. "Right rail," I whispered, more to myself than Rick. A pair of jeans lay caught on a jagged rock, the legs knotted together in a desperate, frantic twist, the fabric blackened from waist to knee with congealing gore. This was no accident of the rails. A man falling from a moving train leaves a single, violent mark upon the earth, a sudden cessation of being. This was a slow, deliberate flaying. He's running and shedding. The madness of it felt like a curse from a marid, a desert spirit intent on driving a man into the howling wastes until he stripped himself of his very soul to escape the heat of his own blood. Then the lights caught something even more surreal. Small white shapes littered the ties like the teeth of a subterranean beast. Not snow, but bandages. Dozens of them, some rolled, some shredded, stuck to the freezing iron by the sheer force of the gore. "Bandages ahead," I called out, my voice cracking like the ice under our wheels. Rick straightened, his hands trembling slightly on the controls. We were passing through a makeshift infirmary of the damned. Someone had been trying to stem the tide, frantically wrapping wounds that refused to close, leaving behind a trail of gauze that looked like the wrappings of an unraveling mummy scattered across the tracks.
The tracks began to snake around a colossal rock formation, a jagged altar of stone rising from the snow. I told Rick to ease the beast down, feeling the heavy groan of the air brakes as the train slowed to a predatory crawl. The bandages on the rails grew thicker now, bunched in sodden piles that looked like discarded cocoons. Then a single boot appeared, sole up, the leather chewed and stiffened by the frost. Torres's voice was a ragged whisper over the radio. "Boss, there's gotta be a body. Nobody survives that much loss." We rounded the curve, and the headlights swept across a natural stone shelf halfway up the cliffside. My heart seized in a grip of cough, an overwhelming primal terror. There, bathed in our artificial glare, sat a man. He was leaned back against the cold stone, his legs stretched out with a casual, terrifying grace. He wore no coat. His shirt was shredded at the shoulders, revealing skin that looked like weathered parchment. His left arm was a pillar of gore, wrapped from wrist to elbow in thick crimson-soaked bandages that leaked fresh life onto the snow beneath him. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't begging for the mercy of the Malaika. He held a cigarette to his lips, the ember glowing like the eye of an ancient shaitan in the dark. As the lead unit thundered past, he didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his hand in a slow, deliberate wave, a greeting from the edge of the abyss. His eyes, dark and sunken into a face streaked with filth, locked onto mine. There was no panic in that gaze, only a hollow, sentient recognition. He wasn't a victim. He was a witness to his own slow dissolution, watching us pass by as if we were the ghosts and he was the only thing truly alive in that frozen hell. I grabbed the radio, my breath hitching in a throat constricted by the sulfurous air of the cab. "Dispatch, we have a live party. Male, heavily injured, conscious." I looked back, watching his silhouette shrink into the swirling white void. He sat there, a bleeding monument on his stone throne, the cigarette ember a fading spark in the mouth of the Zulmat, the eternal darkness. Dispatch's voice returned, flat and devoid of the terror that now anchored itself in my chest. No emergency stop was ordered. The tracks were clear. The machine had to move. The silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet of the plains, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a qabr. We reached the checkpoint and swapped crews, the transition handled with the mechanical efficiency of men trying to forget. Before Torres climbed down, he lingered in the doorway, his eyes searching mine for a sanity I no longer possessed. "He was real, right?" he asked. I nodded, though I felt the weight of a secret I wasn't meant to carry. Days later, the official report arrived, a cold, sterile dismissal of the nightmare. The sheriff's office found the blood, the clothes, and the shredded bandages, but the man had evaporated into the thin, freezing air. They called him a vagrant, a ghost of the rails who had simply moved on. But I knew better. You don't lose an ocean of blood and simply walk into a New Mexico blizzard. Every time I run that stretch now, my eyes instinctively seek that ledge. I expect to see him there, still waving, still bleeding, a tethered soul trapped between the world of the living and the barzakh. The tracks are no longer just steel, they are a vein, and somewhere out there, something is still drinking.
I almost stopped the video here, because what appears next isn't human. Nahid Hassan kept saying one thing. It's standing behind me. If you're still watching, subscribe to Nightfall Series 2.
I grabbed the radio, my breath hitching in a throat constricted by the sulfurous air of the cab. "Dispatch, we have a live party. Male, heavily injured, conscious." I looked back, watching his silhouette shrink into the swirling white void. He sat there, a bleeding monument on his stone throne, the cigarette ember a fading spark in the mouth of the Zulmat, the eternal darkness. Dispatch's voice returned, flat and devoid of the terror that now anchored itself in my chest. No emergency stop was ordered. The tracks were clear. The machine had to move. The silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet of the plains, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a qabr. We reached the checkpoint and swapped crews, the transition handled with the mechanical efficiency of men trying to forget. Before Torres climbed down, he lingered in the doorway, his eyes searching mine for a sanity I no longer possessed. "He was real, right?" he asked. I nodded, though I felt the weight of a secret I wasn't meant to carry. Days later, the official report arrived, a cold, sterile dismissal of the nightmare. The sheriff's office found the blood, the clothes, and the shredded bandages, but the man had evaporated into the thin, freezing air. They called him a vagrant, a ghost of the rails who had simply moved on. But I knew better. You don't lose an ocean of blood and simply walk into a New Mexico blizzard. Every time I run that stretch now, my eyes instinctively seek that ledge. I expect to see him there, still waving, still bleeding, a tethered soul trapped between the world of the living and the barzakh. The tracks are no longer just steel, they are a vein, and somewhere out there, something is still drinking.
Minutes dissolved into a frozen eternity. The world outside had shrunk to a flickering radius of yellow light, barely penetrating the swirling sear of the blizzard. I dropped my speed until the Corolla was crawling, a wounded animal in a forest of white ghosts. There were no other travelers, no distant glow of a ranch house, only the desolate, unplowed stretch of asphalt where the snow piled into walls like the ramparts of a forgotten city. Every gust of wind felt like a heavy hand trying to guide me into the ditch, a shallow grave waiting to be filled. Then the mirrors flared. Two orbs of brilliant, blinding light materialized in the rear view, cutting through the snow like the eyes of a shaitan. My heart leapt with a sudden, foolish hope. I thought it was a plow, a mechanical savior sent to lead me out of the Zulmat. I slowed even further, waiting for the Leviathan to pass so I could follow in its wake. But the vehicle did not pass. It surged forward until its bumper was a mere breath away from my trunk, its high beams incinerating the shadows in my cabin. The glare was absolute, washing out the dashboard and turning the interior into a theater of harsh white light. The beast finally swung left, pulling alongside me with a roar that vibrated in my very teeth. It was no plow. It was a white Chevy Silverado, lifted high on aggressive, mud-caked tires that chewed through the drifts as if they were nothing more than ash. The truck was a relic of violence, scarred by rust, laden with lumber bound by fraying straps. As it matched my speed, the passenger window slid down. A bare arm, oblivious to the biting Zamharir, the extreme cold of the underworld, rested on the door. A faded, twisted tattoo coiled around the forearm like a serpent of the old sands. I turned my head, my breath hitching in a lungs filled with the scent of ozone and fear. Through the side window, the silhouette of the driver remained a featureless void, but the passenger was terrifyingly clear. He was a man carved from the very desolation that surrounded us. His eyes were pale, washed-out blue, the color of a dead sun, and they remained locked on mine with a flat, empty stare that held neither malice nor mercy. It was the gaze of a ghoul watching a feast that had not yet stopped breathing. The truck began to drift. It wasn't a sudden slip or a loss of control on the ice. It was a slow, predatory push. The white fender slid closer to my side mirror, forcing me toward the shoulder where the snow rose in treacherous, uneven mounds. "No, no, no," I whispered, a frantic zikr of survival. I corrected the wheel, my tires screaming for purchase on the black ice. The Chevy drifted with me, harmonizing its movements with my terror. We were no longer two vehicles on a highway. We were a predator and prey locked in a ritual dance. The passenger's mouth twisted into a grin, a jagged psychic tear across his face. He raised a hand, not to wave, but to point, one finger extended toward me, steady amidst the howling gale. Then, with a slow, agonizing deliberation, he turned his hand sideways and shoved it through the air. The message was clear, a command from a dark sultan: "Get off the road."
I shook my head, my hands trembling against the wheel. To leave the pavement was to surrender to the white grave of the desert. The truck leaned in again, the whine of its massive tires, a high-pitched dirge in the storm.
The truck dropped back, disappearing into the swirling white shroud behind me. For a heartbeat, I allowed myself to believe the fitna, the trial, had ended. Perhaps the driver had grown weary of the sport, or the cold had finally reached even his blackened heart. But then came the first contact. It was a soft nudge, almost affectionate, like the brush of a phantom's wing against my rear bumper. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird in a cage of bone. Then the Chevy unleashed its full, unholy power. The truck slammed into my rear, the engine roaring with the hunger of a starving Ifrit. The Corolla jolted forward, my tires spinning uselessly against the ice. I was no longer a driver. I was a passenger in a vessel of glass and steel, being propelled into the void at a speed that defied sanity. The high beams flooded my interior, turning the snow ahead into a blinding white wall. I tapped the brakes, a desperate attempt to reclaim my agency, but the scent of burning rubber and smoke filled the cabin instantly. The truck didn't slow. It surged, pinning me to the road, keeping me at the mercy of its murderous momentum. He began to swing the massive Silverado side to side, a rhythmic, terrifying swaying. The bumper flicked against my rear fenders, left, then right, sending jolts of kinetic force through the chassis that threatened to send me into a terminal spin. Each hit was a calculated strike, a test of my resolve and the Corolla's failing grip. "Stop!" I screamed into the uncaring wind, my voice swallowed by the engine's growl. The next strike was the final verdict. He rammed the left fender with the force of a falling mountain. The world shattered, the back end of the car swung wide, and I watched through the glass as the horizon spun. Headlights, snow, darkness, headlights, the ditch rushing toward me like the open maw of a grave. The Corolla struck the embankment with a bone-jarring thud, a sacrifice offered to the frozen earth. Snow exploded around the windows like white dust from a shattered tomb. I sat there, gasping, my lungs burning with the frigid air and the acrid tang of the deployed airbag. The world was silent, save for the ticking of my dying engine. I looked toward the road, expecting the shadow of the white Chevy to loom over me, expecting the man with the pale eyes to finish what he had started, to drag me into the Zamat, where the sun never rises. But the road was empty. The high beams had vanished as if they were never there, leaving only the howling wind and the shifting drifts. There were no tire tracks leading away, no scent of exhaust, just an unbroken sheet of white. It was as if a ghoul of the highway had manifested simply to hunt, then dissolved back into the storm once the blood was drawn. I spent the night shivering in that metal coffin, praying to whatever deities might listen, until a highway patrolman found me the next morning. When I told him about the white truck and the man with the serpent on his arm, he only sighed, his breath a plume of mist. He spoke of the madness of the whiteout, of how the brain invents demons when the eyes have nothing but static to feed upon. But as he towed my wreckage away, I saw him glance nervously at the unmarred snow on the shoulder. I moved to Texas, but the desert never truly let go. To this day, when the sky turns gray and the wind begins to moan, I check my rearview mirror, waiting for the twin suns of the Silverado to ignite in the dark behind me. This is where the real horror begins.
And trust me, what happens next, you won't forget. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe to Nightfall Horror 002, because something even more terrifying is coming. The third tale of my life's descent into the Barzak of the rails began long after the blood trail and the white truck had become scars on my soul. My father had always spoken of the iron web, a network of tracks that didn't just carry freight, but acted as a copper seal across the ancient, restless earth. He claimed the stations weren't just for paperwork, they were watchtowers meant to ensure the shayateen stayed beneath the ballast. I had laughed then, but as I sat in the lead unit of a heavy haul through the skeletal forests of the Pacific Northwest, his warnings tasted like ash in my mouth. The rain was not water, it was a black deluge, a tufan, that seemed to melt the very shadows of the pines. My engineer, a man named Holloway, who smelled of stale tobacco and old secrets, stared through the glass with eyes that hadn't blinked in an hour. We were hauling industrial chemical tanks, lethal, pressurized vessels that hissed like captive serpents. The air in the cab felt ionized, charged with the same malevolent energy that precedes a lightning strike. As we hit the deep grade of the Coffin Ridge, the radio didn't just hiss, it began to chant. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming, a language that sounded like grinding stones and wet earth. Holloway didn't reach for the dial. He simply gripped the throttle tighter, his knuckles white against the dark metal. "Do you hear the whispers of the Dajjal?" he asked, his voice a jagged rasp. I didn't answer. I watched the tracks ahead, where the twin beams of our headlamps were being swallowed by a fog so thick it felt like the breath of 1,000 drowning men. The fog did not roll. It exhaled, rising from the saturated earth like a shroud meant for a giant. It was a zulmat, a darkness so profound that our powerful lamps were reduced to flickering candles in a cathedral of mist. Holloway slowed the train, the massive iron wheels screeching against the wet rails in a chorus of agonized souls. The rhythmic chanting from the radio grew louder, vibrating in the floorboards, a guttural hum that felt like it was originating from the very core of the locomotive. "The sensors are failing," Holloway whispered, pointing to the glowing displays. The gauges were spinning in frantic clockwise circles or dropping to zero, as if the laws of physics had been revoked by a higher, darker power. We were flying blind through the mountain's gut. I leaned toward the glass, my eyes straining against the white-gray wall of the fog. Then the shapes appeared. At first I thought they were trees, charred skeletal remains of a forest fire. But as we crept closer, I saw they were standing on the tracks. Figures, tall and elongated like the shadows cast by a dying sun, stood perfectly still between the rails. They were draped in rags of black silk that didn't flutter in the wind, but hung heavy, as if soaked in the oil of the Jahannam. As the train's nose approached, they didn't scatter, they simply dissolved, turning into swirls of black smoke that were sucked into the intake of our engine. The train shuddered, a violent metallic cough that sent a jolt of pure coughs through my heart. The engine didn't just cough, it began to scream. A high-pitched mechanical wail erupted from the belly of the lead unit, sounding less like grinding gears and more like a captured ifrit being flayed alive. Holloway's face was a mask of gray stone, his eyes fixed on the empty void ahead. "They are the Weavers," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the supernatural din. "They don't want the freight, they want the momentum." The fog suddenly curdled, turning a sickly, bruised purple. Through the haze, I saw the tracks beginning to shift. The steel rails weren't just metal anymore. They were glistening obsidian tentacles that writhed and pulsed with a dark, rhythmic life. They reached up from the ballast, coiling around the wheels of the train, trying to bind the iron beast to the mountain. We were no longer on a journey of commerce. We were being pulled into a seer, a grand illusion of the occult. Then a massive shape loomed over the tracks, a bridge that wasn't on our maps. It was a jagged arch of bone and rusted iron, dripping with a thick black ichor. Hanging from the rafters were thousands of silver threads, glowing with a faint, malevolent light. As we passed under, the threads brushed against the cab windows, leaving behind glowing runes that burned into the glass. My skin began to crawl, 1,000 invisible insects dancing across my flesh. I looked at my hands and saw the faint, shimmering outlines of the same runes beginning to manifest under my skin. The iron web had finally claimed its heir. The cabin transformed into a vessel of the Gaib. The air grew cold, not the chill of winter, but the soul-extinguishing frost of the Barzakh. Holloway finally turned to look at me, and my breath died in my chest. His eyes were gone, replaced by 2 polished spheres of black hematite, reflecting the glowing runes that now pulsed beneath the skin of my own face. "The price of the passage is the weight of the memory," he intoned, his voice echoing as if from the bottom of a deep, forgotten well. The train began to decelerate, but the engine's scream intensified. We were being pulled into the mountain itself, the tracks leading into a yawning fissure that glowed with a dull, subterranean fire. This was the Sigil, the place of eternal recording. On either side of the fissure, the weavers stood in rows, their elongated limbs weaving the silver threads into a massive tapestry that depicted every tragedy the rails had ever witnessed. I saw the man on the ledge from Colorado. I saw the white truck in the New Mexico snow. They were all threads in this infinite, agonizing web. The locomotive groaned, its steel frame buckling under the pressure of an unseen gravity. I felt my own memories being tugged from my mind, the smell of my father's tobacco, the sound of the 90s crew laughing, being spun into the silver silk. I tried to scream, but my voice was merely a hiss of steam. We were approaching the center of the web, a colossal heart of rusted iron that beat with the sound of 1,000 crashing trains. The runes on the glass shattered, and the fog poured in, smelling of ancient copper and the sweat of the damned. The heart of the mountain opened like the maw of an iron god. As the train crossed the threshold of the subterranean fire, the laws of the physical world collapsed into a singular, terrifying point of fauna, annihilation. I felt my consciousness fraying, stretching along the miles of track I had spent my life traversing. I was no longer a man. I was a component of the machine, my heartbeat synchronized with the rhythmic clatter of wheels against the obsidian tentacles. Then the world snapped back. The fog vanished as if exhaled by a dying beast. The gauges returned to their normal rhythmic jitter, and the radio fell into a peaceful, empty static. We were rolling through a clear, moonlit night, the Pacific Northwest forest standing silent and indifferent. I gasped for air, my lungs burning with the sudden return of oxygen. I looked at Holloway, expecting the black stones, but his eyes were blue and weary, staring at the track as they had for 20 years. "Wild night," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. He didn't remember. The weavers had taken his memory as toll, leaving him a hollow shell to pilot the iron coffin. But when I looked at my hands, the runes were gone, replaced by thin silver scars that hummed when we crossed a switch. I reached for my reflection in the window and saw, just for a fleeting second, the man on the ledge in Colorado staring back at me from the glass. I realized then that none of us ever truly leave the tracks. We are all just fuel for the iron web, ghosts in training, waiting for our turn to sit on a ledge and wave at the living as they thunder past into the dark. The journey never ends, it only changes form.
This video is over, but the story isn't, because Nahid Hassan was never found. And if your phone turns on by itself tonight, just know you've been chosen. Subscribe to Nightfall Horrors 002, because you're not safe anymore.